Okay, welcome to 7 Minutes with Jesus. Today we are looking at verses 16 through 26 of John chapter 4. We're continuing our discussion of Jesus speaking with the Samaritan woman at the well. And so turn with me there. I just apologize. Time got away from me yesterday and I wasn't able to get out of 7 Minutes with Jesus, so we'll make up for it today. A little bit late, but better late than never. So let's read John chapter 4, verses 16 through 26. Remember, we've just left off in verse 15. The Samaritan woman has said to Jesus, when he's been talking to her about living water, she says, I want this water so that I can never be thirsty again, so I never have to draw this water. And Jesus says to her in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Go, call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, You are right in saying, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. Okay, so a few really important things here. She's just said, I want this living water. So Jesus says, go call your husband and come here. And this seems like a bit of a non sequitur, and it probably is, but it would have been proper in the social context of the ancient world for this conversation to continue through her husband, who would have had, in the ancient world, legal authority over her. And this is a bit of an unseemly situation anyway, we're going to see, because later when the apostles return, when the disciples come back, and they see that he's talking with a woman in verse 27, they freak out a little bit, and they're trying to basically shoo her away from him. But Jesus doesn't seem concerned with this, but he does ask her to go get her husband, and she answers him, I have no husband. Jesus says to her, you're right, you don't have a husband, and then he lays this on her, that she's had 5 husbands, and she's now with a man who is not her husband. So he says, what you've said is true. So he, without moralizing at her, he lays bare the conditions of her life, that she is, like all of us, she has lost her path, she's lost her way, and she is in need of the teaching of the Messiah, which brings light to all men, and of course women. When we say men, we talk about the broad sense of humanity, as in humans. So the woman says to him, because he's told her these details of her personal life that he can't possibly be privy to, because these people would have had no dealings with one another in any social context anyway, because she's a Samaritan and he's a Jew. He couldn't have known these details of her life. He didn't know her before they met at chance here. And so she says, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. And so going off of that, she wants to ask him this question, which it seems like maybe she thinks is a bit of a test, is going to stump him. And so she says, our fathers, meaning the descendants and the forebears of the Samaritan religion, worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place that people ought to worship. Now you have to understand here that Samaritanism as a religious faith is a sort of offshoot of Judaism, and has its basis in a lot of the same teachings. I mean, the 5 books of Moses but is somewhat more rustic and pastoral and interested in worship in high places as opposed to the temple worship in Jerusalem. And there was this tension and animosity between them religiously and ethnically, and they wouldn't have had dealings with each other socially. So she says, the forefathers of the Samaritans said worship on Mount Gerizim. The Jews say worship in the temple in Jerusalem. Which way is it? And Jesus' answer to her is so telling for us, because he says, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. So these locations are not what's important, Jesus says. In verse 22 he says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Now let's stop there, because that can seem a little bit condescending on Jesus' part toward this woman, telling her, you worship what you do not know. But this is the position that we're all in, right? Even when we're lost in sin, we're trying to fill the worshipful hole in our hearts with things that do not produce worship, that do not produce spiritual fruit. But we're still seeking to worship. We never stop worshiping as human beings. And so the condition of the lost and of most of the world is of worshiping that which they do not know. And often, it's worth pointing out, the Jews themselves did not know the fullness of their own precepts and their own teachings. He says salvation is from the Jews, and of course by that I think he means the Messiah, the liberator, the Savior of the world is coming through the Jewish people and through the traditions that were built into that culture. It all was leading to Christ. But he is saying this worship is a spiritual worship. The worship of the Father is meant to be not based in location or based in external things or appearances, but in the heart and in the spirit. In verse 23, but the hour is coming and is now here. So Jesus says the time is here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. Okay, so I think that spirit and truth part is important. Spirit meaning that it is that part of us that is divine, that part of us that longs for communion with God, our inner self which relates to heavenly things and not earthly things. And then truth being that there's no pretense to true worship. True worship does not pretend to be anything. It is not obsessed with outward appearances and with being regarded as holy and righteous and virtuous. In fact, true worship in spirit and truth necessitates an understanding that we are not righteous and not special and not good in and of ourselves. We need Christ. But the good news is the Father is seeking such people to worship him, he says. And so he says in verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So we've all heard these verses quite a bit, but I think we don't, sometimes we miss how radical this idea of God is spirit was to the Jewish mindset. God was, first of all, was not thought about as a father generally by ancient Jews. He was also not thought about as a spirit. He was thought about as a distant, essentially unknowable force which began all the world, and that of course men have communed with him in the past, and this is how we get the old law, what we call the Old Testament, and the writings and the prophets. But he is mysterious in the Jewish mindset, God the Father, what we would call God the Father. But Christ says God is spirit. So that thing which is in us, which longs for heaven, which relates to the heavenly things, is that same substance of the divine, of God the Father. And so when we worship him, it is our spirits within us longing to commune with him in some fuller sense beyond the limitations of this mortal life in this body. So the woman says to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. So this messianic tradition got into the Samaritanism also. They also looked forward to a Messiah who would come and would reveal everything to humanity. And Jesus so simply identifies himself, I who speak to you am he. And of course, the phrase I am is embedded in that sentence. And that is how God described himself to Moses, is the simplest possible formulation of his existence is I am. And so this formulation that Jesus gives her is not quite so grammatically simple, but in the flesh, it's so beautiful because it is, before God said to Moses, I am, and Moses was expected to accept his existence from that statement as fact. And of course, that in and of itself is a powerful lesson. But as we know from the New Testament, the law was not able to bring men to salvation. The law was not able to bring men into the will of the Father. Rather, it was leading them toward the Messiah, the one who would make it possible for us to live within the Father's will. And so Jesus says to her, I who speak to you am he. So it's not just that we serve a God who is, and who exists in power and might and preeminence. But that power and might and preeminence desires to commune with us, wants to speak to us, wants to be face to face with us, person to person. It's an incredible thought. So again, this is a pretty lengthy discourse, and it's worth breaking it down a little bit, and it means that we got to kind of break it up awkwardly. So we'll come back and we'll finish this discourse with the woman at the well. We'll try to cover a lot of ground next week. Actually, not next week, 2 weeks from now, because I'm going to be going home next week, so I won't be here. So 2 weeks from now, on Thursday, look forward to finishing up John chapter 4 and the discourse with the woman at the well, verses 27 through 45. We'll try to get all that done. And in the meantime, God bless, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.